Hi guys, welcome to Phoenix tutorial part 2. My name is Tensor from the Tensor Programming blog, and today we're going to be extending our chatter application, so our chat application that we built in Phoenix tutorial part 1, and we're going to be adding authentication to it. Don't worry, if you did not follow the first tutorial in this series, you will not actually be lost. In fact, you could build an authentication app with the steps that we're about to do without having the chat backend. And that's one of the cool things about Phoenix. With Phoenix, you're able to build things in a very modular way, and we're going to use that to our advantage. Alright, so this is what our application looks like. We can type stuff in and it will show up as a message. And if you want to actually sign into the app, you have to put in a question mark, then the user, and then the name of the user. And we can sign in as many users as we want, and they'll show up right here on the right hand side. So of course, even though we do have this chat application and it works, the biggest problem is the fact that no one can really sign in without having to manually enter in their username inside of the URL. Also, we have no security. Anybody can get onto this chat application, and there really is, no real authentication here. It's just one single page, and we have nothing else going on. So today we want to build an actual module that will allow people to log in and log out. Alright, so to get our database working, we first want to go into our config dev.exs file, and we want to put in the username and password for our Postgres SQL database. And currently mine is the default, which is Postgres and Postgres, but yours might be different, so make sure to enter in a username and password. After putting your username and password into the dev.exs file, we can now run mix.ecto.create. Now this command will actually compile our entire application, and then it will create a database. And if you guys remember, we actually ran this command in the last tutorial. For the sake of simplicity though, I went ahead and I dropped the database that we created back then. So if you were following along from the original tutorial, from the first tutorial, you may not have to do this step. Alright, so after our database is actually created, we want to go ahead and create a model. So we're going to use this scaffolding tool that's built into Phoenix, and the scaffolding tool that we're using is mix.phoenix.gen.model. Then we put in the name of the model, which in this case is user, and then the plural name, which would be users. Then we put in the two fields that we want, or as many fields as we want. If we wanted, like, say 10 fields, we could put those in as well. So in this case, we want an email field, and I'm going to say this email field is unique. That way somebody can't use an email to sign up multiple times. And then we're going to have an encrypted password field, which will be of type string. Now if we actually run this command, you'll see that it actually creates 3 files. The first file right here is our actual model. The next file is a test for our model. If we wanted to run test-driven development, this is the file that we do it in. And then the final file is the actual migration that will be run when we run mix.ecto.migrate. So if we go into priv repo migrations, and then we look at the migration, we can actually take a look at what we built here. And you'll see here we have this little change function, and this is the function that's going to be run on our SQL server. And it says here that we want to create a table called users, and we're going to add an email field, which will be of type string, and then we're going to add an encrypt password field, which will be of type string, and then we're going to run this timestamps function. Now the timestamps function will give us 2 other fields, and these fields will be when the user was created, and if the user is ever edited, it will also have another timestamp for that. There will be a 5th field inside of the actual table inside of the SQL database, and that will just be the ID, which will increment up every single time we add a user. The other file that was created was of course our model file. And as you can see in here, we have our 2 fields here. So we have our email and we have our encrypted pass. We have our timestamps as well. And then we have this function called change set, which we'll get to here in a moment. But we also want to add another field inside of our model here. The field that we want to add into our model is called password. And this will be of type string. And it will be what's called a virtual field, which means that it's not actually stored in our database. So the reason why we're adding password in here is so that when a person puts their password into the login, it actually gets hashed, and then we compare the hashed password, which is inside of our database. That way we don't store user passwords inside of the database. The other thing that we want to change real quick is we want to change these encrypt pass down here to password, and again we will get to this change set function here in a second. So now after changing the model, we can run mix.ecto index.migrate, and this will migrate the change into our database. It will create our user table and create the index inside of that table. So let's actually open up the REPL here. So if we run IEX -S mix phoenix.server, this will actually run our server and also drop us into a Elixir REPL. Now if we alias chatter.repo and chatter.user inside of here, now we can call a function called repo.insert, and this will manually allow us to insert a piece of data into our database. And here's what our piece of data will look like. So we have a user struct, and inside of it we have an email field, test@test.com, and then we have our encrypted password field, which will just say password. Now if we run this command, you can actually see the SQL that gets run here. It says insert into users, and then it'll say email, encrypt pass, inserted at, and updated at, and it'll give us all the values, and then it will return the ID, and then it will show us all the values that were inserted. And if we actually update our Postgres data, we can actually see that now we do actually have a user inserted into our database here. This is all nice and good, but one of the problems right now is that we don't currently have a controller to actually allow us to work as a middle ground between our router and our model. So we need to create a controller for users here. So our user controller file will be named user_controller.ex. And to get this to work, we need to just define that it is a controller. So we're going to pull in chatter.web, and then we're going to say controller. We also need to create what's called a view. So let's create a view here. Our view will appropriately be named user view, and it will be inside this views folder here. And our user view just needs to be pointed at chatter.web view. And we don't really need to put anything else in here unless we want some helper functions inside of the HTML that we create for our user. So let's go back to our user controller and let's actually start building some functions here. So first we want to alias our model in here, and our model's name is chatter.user. And then we want to create an index function. So our index function is just going to pull our users out of our repository, so out of our actual database, and then it's going to render a piece of HTML called index.html, and it's going to put those users into the index.html. And this is going to allow us to actually view the users inside of the HTML layer. We'll be able to take them out of the database and put them into a piece of HTML that people can see. Now of course we need to actually add a route for this controller. So let's go into our router.ex. And currently we have our page controller, which is the controller for our chat, onto it. We also want to put our user controller in here as well. Alright, so to add our user controller to our actual web routing system, all we need to do is put it right here. We need to just write resources, and then we put in the actual route that we wanted on top of, which is users. And then we put the user controller, and we refer to it at the end here. So now if we open up our server and we go to users, we're going to actually get an error, and that's because we don't have our index.html built yet. So let's do that now. So we go into templates, and then we want to create a new folder. We're going to call this folder user, and inside of user we're going to create a file called index.html.eex. So here's what our HTML is going to look like. So we're just going to say listing users, or we're going to say list of users, and then we're going to have a table, and inside the table we'll have the email, and it will list under the email all of the emails of our users, and then we'll have a link under each of our users that says show, and this will lead us to another part of our controller later, and then we'll have a link under that will say new user as well. So if we take a look at what we have here, we have our list of users, and again we have the email, we have the user that we put into the REPL, which is test@test.com, and then we have this show button, which if we click will actually lead us to nothing, and we'll go over how this is actually working here in a moment. So now let's actually jump back into our user controller and actually build a show function. So the concept of our show function is to allow us to basically view each individual user's quote-unquote profile. So if that user is signed in, they should be able to see their information. So here's our show function, and what we're going to do is say def show. We're going to pass in the con, so the connection, and then we're going to pass in this map, which is ID to ID, and then we're going to pull the user out of the repository repository with this user repo.get function, where we're passing in user and then the ID that's being passed through here, and then we're going to render a piece of HTML with that specific user. Alright, so now let's make the show.html.exx file, and this piece of HTML is just going to be very simple. As you can see, it just says showing user, and then it's just an unordered list with a bunch of list items, and then in bold we have the email, and then we have a piece of embedded Elixir that allows us to actually get the user.email out of our controller. So if we click the show now, it will actually send us to this page. Now we can actually add one more thing to this, and that's a link. So the way links are structured in Elixir is similar to how a link is structured in HTML. So we just use embedded Elixir, and then we specify link, and then the actual text that's going to display on that link, and then we say where this link is going, and this link is specifically going to the quote-unquote user path, which is an actual route that's specified inside of our Elixir routes, and then we send the connection into it, and then we specify the function that we want it to actually refer to, in this case index. Now we can actually see what routes are available in our application by simply typing in mix phoenix.routes. As you can see here, we have a bunch of user paths. We also have our page path, which is just an index. Now our page path is where our actual chat is residing currently. So looking at this, you can really infer that Phoenix sort of uses that Crud style of doing things. Crud stands for create, read, update, and delete. So as you can see here, we have our index, which allows us to read things. So it shows us all of the users in our model. And then we have our edit, which allows us to update, as well as our update function, which also allows us to update. Then we have new, which allows us to create, and show, which again is reading. And we have create, which again is another create function. But as you can see, this one's post rather than get. So for example, new is the form and create is the actual post. So when you actually click submit on the form and create a new user, that's how this is working. The same with edit and update. Edit is the get, so it's the form, and then update is either a patch or a put. And then of course the D in Crud, which is delete, we have right here, which is our delete method. Alright, so I've restarted the server and now we're back in the user controller. So thus far we have our index and our show, so we're covering the read part of Crud. So let's actually step back and start building our create functions. So the first part of our create is our new function, and remember this is a get function. So our new function is just going to lead us to an empty form, in this case that will allow us to put in an email and a password to create a new user. Our new is actually quite a bit like our index function. The biggest difference, however, is that we're referring to this change set function. Now the change set function is actually the change set function that's inside of our model here. Now change sets in Phoenix are basically just fancy terms for structs, and these structs are sort of interesting because they allow us to do filtering, casting, validation, definitions of constraints, and manipulating the models themselves. So rather than getting our user directly out of the repository in this case, we're just getting the quote-unquote shape of the user and we're putting it into the HTML so that when a person fills out that form and they hit submit, then they'll actually be filling in that part of the model. Alright, so this refers to another piece of HTML, which is new.html, so let's build that. Alright, so this is what our new.html is going to look like, and this is sort of idiomatic Phoenix. What we're basically doing is we want to reuse our form.html, so the actual form itself. So we're going to create a partial piece of HTML that will be called when we call this piece of HTML that will be rendered inside of this piece of HTML. And as you can see, it says render form.html, and then it passes in the change set, which comes from our user controller function, and then it passes in the action, which will be our create function. And then we just have underneath of the form that gets rendered, we have a link to back, which will send us back to the user path of index. So let's create the form.html now. Alright, so this is the most complicated piece of HTML that we've dealt with yet. First, we have this piece of embedded Elixir at the top, and it's saying form for at change set, comma, at action, and then we're opening up an anonymous function here. And then we're saying if at change set.action do, and then we have a bunch of stuff in here. So what's basically happening is we're saying form for, and the change set here is referring to our data, and then the action here is create in this case, if we're coming from new.html. So this should say form for change set, which would be our user, and then action, which would be create. And then we have this if statement. So this if statement is basically saying if our change set comes back with a specific action, which in this case is a error, it will say, oops, something went wrong, please check the errors below. So this block will not actually show every single time this piece of HTML loads. Underneath of it we have two divs. Both of them are very similar. So inside of these divs we have a label element. So this just is label of f, and f refers to our anonymous function here. And this is for our email. And then we have our class. So we're using typical Bootstrap. So it's just control label. Then we have our input. So it's email input f. And this could be text input, password input, or email input. But because we're putting an email into it, we just want it to be called email input. And then we're referring to the email. And then we have our class in here as well. And then we have an error tag under here. And this error tag will only throw an error out if something happens inside of the change set function inside of our model to our email field. So if our email field is incorrect, this will throw out an error. And the same goes for our password, which is down here. So this is not our encrypt password, if you notice. This is just our password. So the virtual field for our password. So we have our label here, and then we have our input, which is a password input instead of an email input, because we don't want people to actually see the password as somebody's typing it in. And then of course we have our error tag as well. And then below all of that we have a button. So this submit, this is actually a button, and then we're using Bootstrap, and then we have this end piece as well. Now if we want to go and look at our page here, this is what our user's new page will look like. And as you can see, it is just basically a form, create a new user, and then we have our email and our password. Now if we were to hit submit, it would just create an error, and that's because we haven't created our create function yet. Alright, so let's create our create function. Now this is going to be slightly more complicated than any of the other functions that we've currently created. If you remember that this function is actually a post, this is not actually that difficult to understand. And inside of it we're passing the connection, and then we are passing this map, which is referring to our user element, and it's putting it inside of user params. Then we are going to our change set function, which is coming from our model, and we're pulling out an empty user, and then we're populating it with our user params. Then we want to run a bit of pattern matching on our repo.insert. So if the change set struct that we've created here, the one that's come through the form, satisfies the rules of our change set model, then it will actually be inserted into our database, and we'll get back this OK, user, in which case we pass the connection and we put a flash message on it, and this flash message will say users created successfully, and then we redirect to the user path of index. So this will actually take us back to user index. Then if we have an error, then all we do is re-render the new.html, and we put the change set back to normal. So we reset it. So now if we just hit submit on this form here, we'll get our little block to appear that says, oops, something went wrong, check the errors below. And we'll have these little can't be blank items pop up for our email and for our password. So now that with this form we can actually create users. So if I type in metal@test.com and then say type in a password of say 6 characters and hit submit, we actually now have a second user. And we can hit show on this metal@test.com, and this will go to the user profile page as well. And we can create as many users as we want. But one of the big problems that we currently have is that our passwords are not actually being encrypted, and they're not actually being stored in our database as a result of that, because we're not actually passing anything from our password field, which is just virtual, to our encrypted password field. Before we actually look at how we can encrypt passwords though, let's actually implement our edit function and our update function. Now the way this edit function actually works is that we pull our user out of our repository, so our database, using repo.get. And then of course, since we're passing in the ID, we're pulling one user out. So we're referring to the user by their ID. Then we also want to create a change set. So we want to create the shape of the model that we want to pass through, because we're going to be rendering a form with our edit here. And then we're going to render our edit.html by passing user and change set to it. So the form will actually already have the user's email address inside of it. And then when they edit their password, for example, it will just update the password inside of the database. Of course, all of that is taken care of by the update function. Alright, so here's our update function, and as you can see, we're getting our connection, Then we're getting an ID and of course the user params. So this stuff is coming from the form, and then this stuff is coming from the user ID that we already had selected from the edit function here. And then we're saying get the user out of the repository, and then create the change set and populate it with the user params. And then we want to run a little bit of pattern matching on repo.update. We want to figure out if the user params fit our change set. And if they do, we're going to get OK and user back, in which case we send our connection down, put flash, user updated successfully. Then we redirect to the user path show, so back to the user profile. If we get an error, however, we just re-render edit.html. All right, so now let's actually create edit.html. Alright, so because we created our form.html, we can reuse it inside of edit.html. So all we're doing here is we're going to edit our user, and then we're going to render our form, and we're going to send the change set and the new action, which will be update, to it. And then we'll have a link that will send us back to index if something bad happens. We can also go into our index here, and we can add an edit link right here. So we have a show link here, and now we have an edit link. So this will allow us to get to our show and to our edit. So the profile, we can actually change this from show to profile and then edit. And if we look, now we have our profile and our edit user. If we click edit user, it brings us this form again, and we can edit the email as well as the password. Now, of course, we could make it so that you can't actually edit the email, but this is something that we'll look at later. But if you wanted to change the password for this, for example, I can just type in a new password. And as you can see, our new flash message pops up and it goes to our show user profile. Alright, so now finally, if we want to actually complete the Crud idea, then we need to implement a delete function. Now our delete function is real simple. All we're doing here is we're going to call the user by ID directly. We're going to get the user from the repository, and then we're going to just delete the user with this repo.delete function. Then we're going to send the connection. We're going to put a flash on it, so it just says user was deleted successfully. Oh, and by the way, these little atoms, let's say info, 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 you could write danger or primary or whatever. These are just bootstrap classes. So for example, the box will be blue in this case. We could make it red if we wanted to just by writing danger. And then we will redirect back to user path, which will be index. So we'll redirect back to our index of users after we've deleted our user. And all we really need to do to actually implement this function is to actually add a link into our index.html that points to delete. So we'll put our link underneath our edit user link. And our link is a little bit more complicated than our other links. As you can see here, we have link, then we have the text delete user, then we have the actual path. So this is pointing towards our delete function. Then we have a method called delete, which is pointing towards our delete function yet again. Then we're going to put a bit of data in here, which is just basically going to pop up a little alert to ask us whether or not we're sure we want to delete the user. And then of course we're going to color it with button danger, which is a bootstrap class. Now if we actually look at it, as you can see it's red. If we click it, this box opens up and we can hit cancel or we can hit OK. And it will actually delete the user. Alright guys, so that's it for this tutorial. We implemented basically the bare bones of our authentication. I wanted to walk through this very iteratively and do this kind of slowly because I wanted to be able to explain each and every piece to you guys. Now there are faster ways to generate all of these functions, generate all the HTML even, and get all of this running. And we'll actually take a look at one of those ways in the next tutorial when we actually implement our hashing of the password as well as sessions. Alright guys, well if you enjoyed this tutorial, feel free to like and subscribe. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to leave them in the box below. And if you dislike the video, then by all means, go ahead and bitch about it as much as you want. I hope you guys have a good day.